Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 10 cheat sheet. I'm FPL Fran, and we'll be looking at the changes this week in terms of FPL for Game Week 10. This week, I do think the significant changes really are Arsenal start to have a swing. Now, of course, they have Newcastle next week, but you know that ultimately the run of games is very, very good. And a jumping position or a landing spot really of Sheffield United at home, I think is perfect. It is actually, in my opinion, the best fixture in the league by far. Sheffield United have seemingly become worse than Luton in my estimation. And the target Luton, target Burnley, target Sheffield United mantra, I think, will hold very, very true this season, as it turns out. A lot of hauls versus Burnley lately, and I wouldn't be surprised if, let's say, there were huge hauls in the Sheffield United game this week. So let's start off the midfield position. I've actually added Adingra. You might notice that actually on various podcasts lately and also just on general social media platforms that I've been very, very hyped into Adingra. We'll see what happens tonight in terms of European fixtures for Brighton. I think that could be a chance for Adingra to have some rest. He might also play. But as you can also hear in Roberto De Zerbi's recent press conference ahead of the Europa League fixture, he has mentioned that Adingra will be important in these fixtures. And so this is the simple reality with March being out for quite a long time. And this obviously helps his point of view, as an FPL asset, because when you compare him to Palmer, the big thing that Adingra has in front of him is good fixtures. When you own Palmer, you actually need other defenders to come in and rotate with him. You need maybe even 8 attackers to accommodate Palmer, right? Because yes, of course, it's nice to hold Palmer until, let's say, game week 16 or game week 14 when Chelsea have good games again. You could play him in game week 10, but after that, it's actually very tough to play a Chelsea player, which is why I like Palmer on a wild card, but I don't really like Palmer as a free transfer. I do quite like Adingra, but I understand some people will take some time to get used to getting adjusted as well with the sort of metrics and also just ultimately how quick Roberto De Zerbi latches on to new players. I think that's something that I've noticed last season, even someone who jumped on to Steele, for example, away from Sanchez last year. But it is a question of risk appetite. In terms of the 5.x position, no changes here. I do think Gordon and Neto are clearly the best. Chan has a risk where obviously he will be going towards the Asia Cup as well. So if you want to look into the future and you don't want to spend transfers on this sort of position, then Chan actually probably will be a future transfer. As far as Douglas Luiz, it's lovely, of course, that he's on set pieces. It's lovely, of course, that he's on penalties. But open play is something that I'm still concerned about. Yes, of course, he scored an open play goal outside the box that maybe you could argue Areola should have saved. But he still doesn't get enough open play underlying stats for us to really consider him as an incredible asset. I think he's great. I think he's a good budget pick, but I think we can do better with Gordon and Neto, and I think we have done so far. As far as the 6.x position, Diaby obviously has been a little bit dismaying, but I really wouldn't move away from Diaby. This is the time to invest into Diaby. You've got a Luton fixture in the future and a Fulham fixture in the future, both at home, and Nottingham Forest away. I mean, it doesn't really get better than that when we're talking away fixtures. So I do still like that fixture. And then when we're talking Matoma, this is also once again the best time to jump onto him because he's got Sheffield United very, very close in the future. And Everton, yes, that actually I would argue is a conversely tougher game, but we know Brighton are also a slightly better attacking team than Aston Villa. So it's actually quite nice to own Matoma for that fixture. As far as Mbumo, he's sort of in that territory where I believe if you're a sort of traditional fixtures person, this is the time to jump off of Mbumo. This is the time to sort of invest into Diaby, into Matoma, or even Bowen, and to say goodbye to Mbumo for a few weeks and actually have him back in your team as soon as game week 14. And that's sort of the position that I've taken with Mbumo with my team. However, I can also accept the argument that you might believe there's no other penalty takers in this price point. He is a ridiculous player. He is a season keeper, as we've mentioned time and time again, and he could be kept in your team. So it's really a question of priorities for you. Ward-Prowse is someone that I think even with good fixture runs, I haven't seen enough of an uptick from his underlying stats to suggest that I think he's super interesting. Yes, of course, the underlying stats have improved from the previous year in Southampton, but I also think that it's not necessary that West Ham will take extreme advantage of these fixtures. I think, if anything, they're one of the fixtures to target. So when we look at fixtures in the future, I do think we need to look at them with a slightly more jaded sense. As far as 7.x players, we're looking at Martinelli, Bowen, and Szoboszlai here. What I would say about these picks is Martinelli and Bowen feel like the nicest plays because of fixtures. Martinelli, of course, you run slight risks with, let's say, Trossard coming back into the team at times. Although we do know that Jesus is injured for a while, which means Nketiah is probably coming back. I wouldn't pay too much heed towards the narrative that Martinelli is only good when Jesus is on the field, because I can recall even last season myself going from Martinelli to Odegaard during a run where Jesus was injured, right, before he sort of returned, and Martinelli went absolutely mental, playing alongside Trossard as well. And I still think that can happen. Yes, of course, he might have an intrinsic relationship with Jesus, but it's not the only relationship on the team that Martinelli has, and he's a great player, so nothing really wrong with him. He's probably the pick that I would like to go with if you, let's say, don't particularly rate Bowen and you somehow cannot reach Saka or Odegaard. And for now, I do quite like Martinelli at his price, given that he's gotten 3 price drops compared to his sort of season starting price. As far as Bowen, he's sort of had the opposite effect, where he's had a lot of price rises conversely. And I do think he's sort of reaching the sort of critical mass point where he is maybe a little bit overpriced, but the fixtures are still very good, as I said, with West Ham. The question, of course, is, do you rate West Ham as much? So that, for example, takes away things like expected clean sheets. That takes away how highly you value these good fixtures, because arguably, when you're, let's say, looking at Everton, I mean, they're arguably a better team than West Ham, right? Just in terms of what I would expect from the result. Obviously, it's a home fixture, so West Ham should do well, but Everton actually, from an underlying basis, have actually been incredible. So how easy are these fixtures truly for West Ham is probably one question to ask, but you can't deny that the fixtures are still relatively good. So Bowen himself having really good NPXGI is something that's very nice, and that's why I'm ready to give him a rise. And I would argue, obviously, that he's the pick that I would go with if I was to pick a West Ham asset, and definitely not Ward-Prowse. As far as Szoboszlai, he falls. We still haven't really seen enough of an uptick in terms of underlying stats. We've also seen that free kicks now are, for example, back on Trent Alexander-Arnold's duty. So that takes away avenues for Szoboszlai to get into points, and for that reason, he falls. Luis Diaz, Foden, Sterling. These are all players where I think the minutes aren't good enough, either for Luis Diaz or for Foden and Sterling. It's a case really of the fixtures, and the fixtures aren't good enough. And with Foden, we mentioned that his underlying stats have actually dropped off a cliff, and I don't expect that to change too much because Man City's attack has gotten slightly worse. If anything, only Haaland has really maintained his sort of underlying stats from the previous season, and Alvarez is the only player who's seen a good uptick. And he also has, for example, hidden attributes, right? This Alvarez pick in the sense that he now has set pieces compared to what KDB used to possess. As far as the subprime position, which is sort of Son towards, let's say, the 8.x players, I would like to say that Maddison falls, but it's a very regrettable fall. I do think that the way the meta is, you can't really own Son, Saka, Maddison whilst owning Haaland. So maybe within the context that you are going Haaland-less, Maddison can remain as a green pick for the foreseeable future. But I still think this is the time right now to actually generally consider going from Maddison away to Saka instead. And I'd rather probably keep Son. The way I see it, and the way actually I spoke about on a podcast with Let's Talk FPL Andy, is he makes a good point where if you own Son, it's still much easier to downgrade into someone else, right? If Maddison suddenly gets onto penalties, it's always easier to downgrade there. But for now, it's very hard to push up to Son if you suddenly sacrifice that position and start spending the money elsewhere. So I do really like Son, and I think they're both equally great players in terms of their value for money. So when I think about that sort of structural argument of why you should keep Son, I think that holds true. Not to mention that Son could also be the best captaincy in Game Week 13. It really depends on how we continue to assess this Man City team going forwards. As far as Fernandes, he falls as a symptom of obviously this horrendous fixture, and also a case of, once again, United being weaker as a team, as we expect week on week. And as it turns out, the results are getting worse and worse. For example, even our expectations of the defense is getting worse, which obviously even hampers Fernandes from a clean sheet point of view. So I do think this is the time now mostly to sort of prioritize around Son and Saka, and obviously Salah, who sort of leads the list here in the midfield position. As far as the forward position this week, we don't have any changes at all, and it's a position I don't really want to spend too much time on. I think if I was to rehash some things, I do think it's interesting that João Pedro might have more minutes because of Welbeck's injury. However, I'm still very wary that he might be the odd man out in terms of minutes, because Ansu Fati is the one who I would argue has been showing a little bit more form lately. And I'm not saying form in terms of, oh, you must buy Ansu Fati, but form in terms of what Roberto De Zerbi is going to rate. Maybe it's Ansu Fati's clinical finishing so far, because he has mentioned at times that João Pedro's finishing has been lacking. And that will affect his minutes, right? Because Lallana's also on the bench, and he can play minutes at the 10, even though he hasn't really been resurfaced lately. Ansu Fati getting additional minutes at the expense of João Pedro will still sort of hamper João Pedro's effectiveness as an asset, right? Even though Welbeck is out. As far as other players in the 6.x category, I still think this is, for example, the last week to own Solanke. I think it's such a nice jumping off point if you went for Solanke on wildcard 8, or even if you went for him as a transfer away from Morris on game week 8. So this is now the time, obviously, to enjoy the Solanke fixture and then move away from him. And I do think there's a sort of meta change there where maybe if you're moving away from Solanke, then you can actually consider some of these Brighton assets, or even, for example, just jump onto Lyle Foster and move into a different sort of team structure setup. As far as the sort of 7.x position, not too many changes. We do know that there's an asterisk around Jesus. I think he will be out for a while, as far as I've heard. But the concern is that if you go for Nketiah, I think it's too much of a punt. So therefore, I'm not even considering Nketiah for the cheat sheet. And when we talk about, let's say, players like Højlund, his sort of re-aggravation of the back, I'm not really sure if Ten Hag was sort of being truthful about that. When we look at the Champions League, he played a lot of minutes once again. So to me, it seems like Ten Hag is now seeing that there are other options and Højlund's minutes aren't as nailed as we once thought. And of course, with Isaac's injury, he's going to be out for a while, which obviously upgrades Wilson. So that's going to be a huge impact on the cheat sheet. But is Wilson actually a green option? I would actually argue not, because the fixtures for me are still rather tough. The good fixtures are also away from home, and we know that Wilson generally struggles with fitness as well. So I do think this is a good time maybe to actually look at some of the other assets who would have already got good minutes previously, like an Anthony Gordon, who, as we've seen also with Newcastle, for example, when you look at the EFL Cup game, how they, for example, closed the game in the second half versus City, they were actually able to play without both Isaac and Wilson, and it's very foreseeable that Newcastle can continue to play with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that Wilson will be playing 90 minutes per game, and I think we should tread a little bit lightly with that. As far as players like Watkins and Haaland, prime options, and Alvarez as well, where I wouldn't really consider touching them. Alvarez to Watkins is going to be a very popular transfer this week. I probably wouldn't do it, if I'm honest. I'd rather go towards Saka and away from Maddison, just because Alvarez's next fixture is just that tasty in terms of Bournemouth at home, but obviously make of that what you will. He got rested once again in the Champions League, and we'll see what happens going forwards. As far as the defender position this week, we have no changes outside of Udogie, who I think obviously will be assessed based on Angie's press conference today, so that will obviously have impacts on Udogie and whether he actually is captain your team, because this is right now the great time to move into Tsimikas, the great time to move into Gabriel, or just to reassert, let's say, another Newcastle defender. I have not included Lascelles into this cheat sheet because I do think he's a very, very short-termist pick, and actually Newcastle's short-term fixtures aren't particularly amazing, and you probably also want to actually triple up on Newcastle at one point in the season, and it's very hard to foresee that you'd be respending that sort of position on Lascelles later on, because we like to, for example, keep that 3.9 arguably dead spot in that team. So in terms of the 5.x position, we have Saliba and Schär with some changes. I've only really increased Saliba because I think fixtures are getting better, whereas with Schär, fixtures are getting worse. Ultimately with Schär, if you really want Newcastle defense, you want to back that Newcastle defense, you've got Burn. You can even go Lascelles, as I said, but I probably wouldn't tempt myself like that. And I do think there's such a gulf between Schär and the sort of offensive output that Trippier can bring to the table, and the consistency that Trippier brings that, versus someone like Schär, who used to be a shot spammer but hasn't been spamming the shots this season. As far as the 6.x, the sort of premium position, you are looking at a time where Virgil, of course, is nice, but I think Trent Alexander-Arnold equally so. He is very, very, very ludicrously priced, and I do think you can only reach Trent if you are actually on a no Haaland structure. So his efficiency on your team really just depends on what you're prioritizing, right? If you're no Haaland, I think Trent is a very easy get. If it's not, I think it's actually completely out of your reach. So it really just depends on what your thoughts are on no Haaland or not. As far as the goalkeeping positions for the changes this week, no changes other than Sanchez and Leno fall. I think it's just a case of Chelsea's fixtures getting worse and worse. Same with Fulham's, and ultimately Fulham's defense is generally putrid. I don't think that we can be that confident about Leno being one of the best shot stoppers in the league. It's probably not enough really to save this Fulham team from how destitute they are. As far as Onana, he still has good fixtures, but he'd probably fall soon too after those come around. And then with Martinez, I still think he's overpriced. Vicario, similar situation there, even though he totally bailed this Tottenham team in the previous match. And with Pope and Allison, I love them as picks, but you really can't go wrong with Areola and Turner, and also simply Areola plus a 3.9 goalkeeper, because it's hard to see Areola losing his spot, and he himself holds so much efficiency. And as we talk about, the flexibility in being able to move around outfield positions is very nice. The time I like to make goalkeeper transfers is more around double game weeks, and we don't have any double game weeks in the short term, so there's no real consideration of whether you want to spend additional money on goalkeepers. And that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. If you guys could like and subscribe, that would be highly appreciated. Also, do check out the sort of membership program as well. And once again, thank you so much to the members who support the channel and roll the Hall of Fame.